is the state coordinator of PMAT, which stands for Planning Matters Alliance Tasmania. I think it's a very great opportunity that we can hear from her. Yep.
Right. Excellent. Thanks so much, Jessica, and thanks to the UTAS Planning Society for putting this on today. It's great to be here. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Hello to those people zooming in as well, and we've got a few people in the lecture theatre as well. Okay, well, let's just get started. If the idea is, I'll just talk about what PMAT is, some of our key issues, that kind of thing, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. But if anyone's got any questions during, feel free just to track my attention and ask a question. So we'll keep it as informal as we can as well. I'd like to start. Let's go to the first slide. So today is about, the theme of today was decided by the UTAS Planning Society, which was help us build a resilient and sustainable Tasmania. And we think the planning system is a great way to do that. And we'll be just touching on, that's sort of the lens of today, is resilience and sustainability. Not quite sure why that's up there. Is that, can that be moved? Yeah, thanks. Great. Thank you. If I'd like to go to the next slide.
Next slide.
Yes, please. Thanks. Great. So PMAT believes that a planning scheme must offer a balance between development, individual rights and community amenity, and not just make it easier for development at the cost of communities and wild places. So one of the key bits of work that we're going to be doing over the next few years is to look at compiling a values-based planning system, so to guide development decisions. And next slide, please. And usually in these kind of talks we actually explain what a planning scheme is, because most people don't have any idea, and this is part of the reason why PMAT exists, was to raise the profile of planning in Tasmania. And this is a fantastic quote by the former Planning Institute of Tasmania President Irene Duckett actually said this, and it was around the time that they were introducing the Tasmanian Planning Scheme, which has not yet been implemented. And the government was talking about a fairer, faster, cheaper, simpler planning system. That was the Tasmanian Liberal government. But as the president of PIA so aptly says in this quote, is that planning is like a skin, and it is very complex and covers so many issues, from urban design to architecture to transport planning, social planning, economics, tourism, social equity, health and education, infrastructure, natural resources, climate change, heritage, amenity, agriculture, bushfire management and environment. So it covers everything, and this is why, really part of the reason why PMAT formed, because it's almost like planning is, it affects everything, so almost no one's responsible in a way, in terms of advocacy work I'm talking about. So rather than simpler, planning would achieve better outcomes with a mantra of strategic, sustainable and integrated. And that's partly reflected in PMAT's platform. And the other thing we would say to add to this quote is that the planning system also underpins our democracy, or part of the democracy. If you'd like to go to the next slide. So PMAT formed in 2016, largely because of, solely because of what the Tasmanian, or what's often referred to as the statewide planning scheme, will allow. And so, if you'd like to go to the next slide. So we unofficially formed in 2016, and then we formally formed as an association. Is that just turned off? No. In 2017. So we started with about 6 groups, and now we're at almost 70 community groups from across the state, and we're still growing. So these are just an example of our alliance groups, and our most up-to-date list can be seen on our website. If you'd like to go to the next slide. When we launched our website, we launched our logo, and we launched this brochure on why planning matters and some of the key issues that are related to the Tasmanian Planning Scheme. And there's copies of that brochure here that you can take away today. There's also copies on our website. So these just highlight some of the key issues of the Tasmanian Planning Scheme and why we're concerned. If you'd like to go to the next slide. And last year we were delighted to receive or be named the National Planning Champion for Australia in terms of our advocacy work by the Planning Institute of Australia. So it was an acknowledgement of all our hard work and really raising the issue around, or bringing it to the attention of the community around the importance of planning. Okay, next slide. As I mentioned before, PMAT has created a platform, it's available on our website. And essentially, this is the key guiding principle of the Planning Matters Alliance Tasmania. And what we're saying in this is that there are 6 key principles that we would like to see underpin Tasmania's planning system. And I'll be touching on these in more detail next, and I won't be going through them sequentially. I'll just be jumping around a bit and you'll see why. They aren't necessarily in any order of priority, but this is our remit essentially, so this is what we work within, these 6 key principles. So all our work is around community and environment, strategic vision, ensuring that the planning system is transparent and independent, that there's community involvement, that there should be integrated decision making and across different land uses, and also we strongly believe that planning should be delivered through local government. And there are copies of this platform document here today too that you can take with you, or you can come and get one now if you'd like to follow it through. Okay, let's go on to the next. And so this is what we would say, this is one way that we can build resilient and sustainable communities, is by delivering our platform. So what do we do? So essentially PMATs, we call ourselves advocates, as well as raised as educators around what the planning system is, and also encourage communities to engage in it. So we're calling for a strategic and sustainable community driven vision for Tasmania, for example, through the development of state policies, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, as well as we are advocating for changing the actual rules within the Tasmanian Planning Scheme, so that's in the zones and the codes. And for example, the general residential zone is a big concern of ours, as well as the natural assets code. There's a whole range of issues. And also then the other thing we do is encourage communities to engage in the planning system, and I'll be touching on this a bit later around how communities can engage in the development of their local provision schedule, and I'll explain what that is. Okay, so next slide please. So apparently this is one of the few flowcharts of Tasmania's planning system. It's in this document that's on the front table here. So one of the key bits or parts of the planning system that is missing relates to strategic vision. And this is where PMAT's been calling for the development of state policies since we started. So the state policies are here, and essentially they're supposed to inform the rest of the planning system. But at the moment we've only got 3 state policies, and the Tasmanian Liberals said in the 2014, or leading up to the 2014 state election, that they would develop a range of state policies to inform the development of a statewide scheme, so all the Tasmanian Planning Scheme, which is this part of the flowchart. But they've failed to do that, unfortunately. So we think that the unsaid driving policy setting is population growth and tourism. So that's something that we think should be done as a high priority. And essentially it's the state policies that set the intention of the planning system. So if you have a plan, what's the intention, what are you trying to achieve? And it's really through the state policies that intention is created. Instead, the Tasmanian Liberals have introduced a new instrument into the planning system called the Tasmanian Planning Policies. They're very different, these two policy areas, and this is what the Liberals are focusing on at the moment. So this has just come out for public comment. They're doing a scoping document that's available for public comment until the end of October. So essentially, state policies are signed off by the Parliament, whereas Tasmanian planning policies aren't signed off by Parliament, and also state policy is a whole of government approach, whereas the planning policies aren't. So there's a big difference. But the government's definitely focusing on the Tasmanian planning policy side of it. Okay, I might go to the next slide. Does anyone have any questions?
Sophie.
Yeah.
Can we pause a little bit because
Sure.
like the people on the Zoom, they couldn't hear us.
Oh, they can't hear.
We'll try to solve this
Sure.
for
Just
like.
more, a little bit.
Okay, sure,
Sorry
no
about
worries.
that. Yep.
Has anyone got any questions while we're waiting?
Close the Zoom.
Sure, yeah, if anyone wants to come and get any of these handouts, feel free.
Is PMAT funded through membership? Is that
So PMAT at the moment, there's no membership fee for Alliance member groups. We're purely funded by donation, and I'm the only paid person in the Alliance, and I consult the Alliance essentially. So yeah, so I'm paid part time, purely through donations.
Great, thank you.
Is it working?
Yep.
Oh, okay, excellent. Hello, Zoom people. I'm glad that it's working. Okay, so we've just been talking about state policies, saying that's one of the areas of PMAT's work that we're calling for the development of, but the government's focusing on Tasmanian planning policies. Have we just gone from, can we go back one slide? Yeah, great. Okay, so we've, we can actually go on to the next slide. So the next thing we'll be looking at is the Tasmanian Planning Scheme. So this is really why PMAT formed initially. This was the sole driving thing that brought us all together. And essentially, the Tasmanian Planning Scheme is still being implemented. So they started developing it in 2016 and it's still being implemented, and it probably will be implemented sometime in full, maybe by the end of next year, something like that. So at the moment, some councils, for example, the Hobart City Council is still operating under the interim planning scheme, so the Hobart Interim Planning Scheme 2015, and all the interim schemes around the state were really done as a stepping stone towards implementing the Tasmanian Planning Scheme. And the first part of the statewide scheme that was signed off, which was in February 2017, were the state planning provisions, and they form the core of the Tasmanian Planning Scheme, and they're made up of the 23 zones and 16 codes. And they need to be reviewed every 5 years, so they're actually going to be reviewed next year. So it will be a great opportunity for PMAT and others to participate in that review to see if we can get some improvements in the zones and the codes. And then, so that was signed off, the State Planning Provisions, SPPs, lots of acronyms, signed off in February 2017. And then the last step in the implementation of the Tasmanian Planning Scheme is the development of the local provisions schedule. So every council across the state will be developing its own local provision schedule, and this is essentially how the SPPs will be implemented in that council area, so the 23 zones or the 16 codes. And then if there's any particular areas that have the special uses or particular values, then you can choose one of these three tools essentially, which are the particular purpose zone, also known as a PPZ. Like UTAS apparently, the Sandy Bay campus will be its own zone, for example. Don't know what now with the city move, what's happening with that, but specific area plans is another way. So they're called SAPs. A controversial example of that at the moment is Canberra Green. That's a SAP. There was a proposed one proposed to put over Coles Bay in the LPS process for Glamorgan Spring Bay, but that's potentially not happening. And then there's the site-specific qualification. So one of those three options you can use essentially to protect or ruin local character, depending on what they're going to be used for. If you'd like to go to the next slide. So this is the Tasmanian Planning Scheme. So as I mentioned before, here are the state planning provisions, and they're made up of these here, the purpose, objectives, administrative provisions, exemptions, zone provisions, code provisions, and then there's the local provision schedule, which is, as I said before, for each council area, and they're how the zone and the overlay maps and lists are implemented in that council, or which go, every single title in each council is given a zone or a code, or they maybe have one of these three over the top of them, or be its own zone, like a particular purpose zone, or a SAT, or a SSQ. So next year we're really encouraging people to engage in the review of the SPPs, because it will be essentially, I need to get this confirmed, but it'll be a 1 in 10 year opportunity basically, because the next time won't be another 5 years after that until it's reviewed. So it's a really great opportunity. Okay, next slide. So these are the state planning provisions. So there's, as I said before, there's 23, and there's no environmental living zones, so this has been a bit of a challenge for some councils, but also there's essentially a new agricultural zone, so that's been quite problematic for some councils, and there's this also a brand new zone called the Landscape Conservation Zone, but essentially they're all new zones, and some of them are more similar to the previous council planning schemes than others. It just varies all around the state. Let's go to the next slide. So they're the 23 zones, and these are the 16 codes. So the codes, obviously, they're like layers that can go over several different zones. So, for example, a bushfire prone area could go over various different kinds of zones. And we have concerns around these codes. For example, there's no heritage code, Aboriginal heritage code, there's no stormwater code, there's no on-site wastewater code, and there's no geoconservation code. So what that means is in development assessment, as an individual, I can't raise stormwater, for example, as an issue at the development application stage. So they're considered elsewhere. So anyway, that's just one of our concerns. Okay, next slide, please. So why is PMAT advocating for changes to the zoning code rules? And essentially, it's because we want to see a resilient and sustainable Tasmania. So that's part of the reason why we exist. So if you'd like to go to the next slide. I know this is very text heavy, but essentially one of the things we say is that a resilient community has a healthy democracy, and with the Tasmanian Planning Scheme, there is, it does reduce the community's right to have a say, unfortunately. Part of that is it removes appeal rights, which is essentially weakening democracy. It doesn't obviously across the board remove appeal rights, but it certainly decreases the opportunity for appeal, which is a really important way for the community to have a say. And also there's a push to remove planning from local government at the moment, from certain sectors of the community. So this is really concerning because we believe planning should stay within local government. And this issue around a healthy democracy and communities being resilient relates to three of our principles. So transparency and independence, community involvement and implementation. So, for example, with Principle 3 of PMAT's platform, we want to ensure that planning and decision-making processes are open and transparent and overseen by an independent commission with appeals heard by an independent tribunal. So if the community wants to have a say over developments, they can do it in an independent way. The same with Principle 4, community involvement, so provide opportunities for informed community input in planning matters and decisions, including the provision of appeal rights. So there is a move at the moment to create a new tribunal in Tasmania, and we are concerned that through that change that the access to appeal rights may change. So the comments, for example, on that are due tomorrow. So there's a bill coming before Parliament sometime this year regarding appeal rights. So we're keeping a big close eye on that. Excuse me. And then with regards to implementation, consistent with all the principles above, we say that planning to be shared between state and local government, with local government to retain primary responsibility for local planning and development decisions through community consultation. So having planning in local government helps keep planning closer to the people, rather than having, which has been flagged, independent assessment panels and removing planning from local government and have developments assessed by panels, which we don't support. Okay, next slide. Another issue we have of the statewide scheme is there's no provision for affordable social housing in the Tasmanian Planning Scheme. So we would say a resilient community provides houses for all, and we should be encouraging, for example, looking at things like inclusion rezoning, where you include some social housing if there's rezones, or other mechanisms basically to try and support the development of affordable or social housing. But instead the government has introduced a new fast-track, what we would say is a flawed housing land supply order process, which fast-tracks land, rezoning land for social and affordable housing. But in doing so, with the larger developments, it really undermines the role of local councils and the Tasmanian Planning Commission. And there's a bill that's just come out for comment, which we've just commented on, which is actually trying to expand the powers of that bill, which we're worried means further undermining the role of local councils and the Commission, Tasmanian Planning Commission. Okay, next slide. One of the other things that we're really concerned about are the residential standards, part of it which they don't encourage gardens, which in our mind is important for creating resilient and sustainable communities, because they're important for providing a source of food, connection to nature, connection to neighbours, places for children to play, mental and physical health, well-being, and beautiful places to be. And the residential standards, which I'll go into in more detail next, essentially were made even worse in February this year through Planning Directive 8, which now allows 100% concrete and roof and 100% concrete across the general residential and inner residential zones. So we're seeing that as a backward step in terms of residential planning. Okay, next slide. Because of the residential standards, there's also no solar access protection if you've got solar panels on your house. And also there's no opportunity to embed sustainable transport, green building design and emissions reductions considerations into the planning process. So the planning scheme is really failing on sustainability, and the opportunities that the scheme could offer just doesn't, unfortunately. So next slide, please. And one of the main reasons why PMAT originally formed was because we were really concerned about the residential standards. And the government actually started reviewing the residential standards last year, I think it was, and we were invited to participate in that, and then they just suddenly stopped for some reason, and then they introduced the new planning directive, which actually made them worse. So we are going to be, we'd love to see some improvement in the residential standards. So this is the problem around tensions around increasing density, but also maintaining amenity. So what we say is, yes, increasing density is important, but councils are best placed to make that decision of where density is most appropriate, not the market. So because at the moment it's very hard to control density. So smaller block sizes are allowed. There's no maximum limit on impervious surfaces, which obviously has biodiversity impacts as well as flooding, increased flooding implications and heat island effects, that kind of thing. No requirement for sunlight into habitable rooms or gardens. Higher buildings built closer to fences on every boundary. Multi-unit developments in all residential areas are allowed, and planning laws no longer require private open space to connect habitable rooms or to face north. That's part of the interim planning directive. Interestingly, in the last couple of weeks, there's a story in the Sydney Morning Herald where this is a urban sprawl in Western Sydney, I think it is, where they've actually banned black roofs, and also they're going to mandate that the blocks, you can see how tight they are going to have space to have at least 2 trees. So we're heading down this kind of direction, but yeah, really part of the reason that makes Tasmania so amazing is our lifestyle and our urban amenity with trees and birds and that kind of thing. So we would love the residential standards to reflect that. Okay, next slide. So one of our principle one is of PMAT's platform is community environment. So prioritising the health and well-being of the whole community, the livability of cities, towns and rural areas, and the protection of the natural environment and cultural heritage. So these next slides will look at some of these issues as to the schemes not delivering that. So we did some modelling on the residential standards just in the general residential zone, and this is before the planning directive. So this was chose a vacant site in Sandy Bay, and this is what you could build in the general residential zone with no notification to your neighbour, no ability to comment and no appeal rights. So that's a multi-unit development within the permitted envelope, and that's why it didn't trigger. So none of these neighbours would be notified. So what we're saying is in order to build community resilience, it's nice to, be kind to your neighbours, and like if we were ever to do something in our house, we'd always consider our neighbours, but if I didn't have to, there are people out there that won't. So next slide, please. So this is what's the permitted envelope in the general residential zone. So it used to be a mixture of like about 5 metres in height across the state, and now it's gone up to a maximum of 8.5 metres. So it's quite substantial, and you can build closer to fences, and overlooking and overshadowing become more of an issue. If you'd like to go to the next slide. So this just shows the planning study and the site plan of what could be built on this area. I don't know, it'd be interesting to go back and actually see what has been built on this site. Like to go to the next slide. The next one. So that just shows some of the privacy issues. This is what's allowed to be built in this zone with no, as that's permitted use, so don't have to advertise that to your neighbour. You only have to advertise if you go outside the what they call the permitted envelope, and it becomes essentially a discretionary development application. Has to be advertised, and you can appeal that. Okay, next slide. This is some of the shadowing issues. And TasPIN, who's the Tasmanian Planning Information Network, which formed specifically in response to concerns around the residential standards, they did some modelling in Hobart, and they showed that an 8.5 metre house would create a 19 plus metre shadow on the shortest day. I think that was on a flat site. So there's implications for your neighbour with regards to, this is the solar access issue, for example, on your solar panels or in your living area or whatever. Okay, next slide. They're just a summary of some of the impacts of the urban or residential issues. So impact on privacy, sunlight onto your garden, impacts on neighbourhood amenity and character. Okay, next slide. This is just going back to some of the code issues. So there's no Aboriginal heritage code, so no provision for impacts on Aboriginal heritage to be considered in development assessment. So there's a code for built heritage, but not for Aboriginal heritage. And as I mentioned before, there's no code for stormwater, on-site wastewater, and geoconservation code. There's some people who are really passionate about geoconservation, that's why we've put that in there. Okay, next slide. And this is one of the big reasons why PMAT formed, was because commercial developments in national parks and reserves is already contentious. And under the new scheme, almost every national park and reserve across the state will be zoned environmental management zone. And in that zone, commercial tourism developments have been made what they call a permitted use. You guys would, all of your planning students, I'm sure, would understand all this. But in that zone, because they've made commercial tourism developments permitted use, that means there's no guarantee of public comment and no appeal rights on almost 50% of the state. So essentially it's not guaranteeing public comment on public land, and there's no guarantee, and there's no appeal rights. So this is really concerning because national parks and reserves were obviously set aside for nature, and there is a push to open up national parks and reserves. So it is seen to be a divisive decision, because at least they could have made the developments of discretionary use at minimum, so that would have at least guaranteed comment and appeal rights. Okay, next slide. And then the other concern is around built heritage code, so European heritage. So there's a fear, it was actually written in the Hobart City Council submission, that Hobart will become a city of facades because of the way the heritage code is written. This statistic has been quoted to me, I haven't been able to verify it, that 50% of Australia's heritage buildings are in Tasmania. So it is a really important part of our heritage and our identity. And so it's part of the reason why people like to live here and people like to visit. But in 2016, 500 houses were removed off the Tasmanian Heritage Register, and part of that justification was that they'd be dealt with by the codes under the Heritage Code at local government level. But many councils, especially regional councils, don't have the resources to deal with Tasmania's built heritage properly. So that's a concern to us. That's one of the areas of work we're looking at more closely at the Heritage Code. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, that's just all the houses being removed from the Tasmanian Heritage Register in 2016. It's just part of the advert. Okay, next slide. Another concern is the Natural Assets Code. This is one of the really big concerns also that Tasmanian Planning Commission had when they developed the state planning provisions with the Natural Assets Code. And essentially, it doesn't apply to agricultural land, commercial or residential zones. That's just one example why it's concerning. And you can't consider priority vegetation outside what's been mapped already under the scheme. And also, my understanding is that the vegetation mapping is only updated every 5 years. So when lots of people are out in the bush doing survey work or new mapping, it can't be reflected in planning schemes in real time. So unless you do a planning scheme amendment, apparently. So it's not responding quickly to improvements in the mapping, which puts biodiversity at risk. Next slide. Another issue, one of our founding concerns was around rural issues, and an unprecedented range of commercial and extractive uses will be permitted in the rural zone, which will further degrade the countryside and Tasmania's food bowl. So we're really fortunate in Tasmania to have such great soil, especially up the northwest, but there is a concern that because of what is now allowed in the rural zones, that it puts some of these areas at risk. Okay, next slide. And another one of our founding concerns was threatens Tasmania's brand. So if you go to the next slide, actually no, go back, sorry. I'll go to the quote later. Professor Michael Buxton, who's the Professor of Planning from RMIT, he came down to our first Planning Matters meeting in November 2016, and he read our draft scheme. So we're still out for public comment at that point. And one of the things he said was essentially the planning scheme will put at risk all the special things that makes Tasmania such a special place to live and to visit, and that underpins the lifestyle that so many people move to Tasmania for, essentially. And his view was if you put that at risk, you also put the state's economic prosperity at risk, because we're not maintaining those values that bring people here in the first place and why we live here. So that was just an interesting observation. Okay, next slide. And the other thing that we're calling for, which is a big ask, but is essentially that there's a lack of integration in land use planning with regard to the fact that forestry, mine exploration, fish farming and dam construction largely sit outside the planning system. And definitely with forestry, for example, it's part of the reason why it's so controversial, because it's not open and has a history of not being open and transparent in terms of decisions. And so that's why our Principle 5 has called to provide an integrated assessment process across all types of developments on land tenures, which include consistent provision of mediation, public comment and appeal rights. So we're seeing to an increasing concern around agricultural industry, for example. So this is where having transparent, robust decision-making processes is really important, and also really important for social licence for those businesses as well. Okay, and next slide. Oh, this is the Buxton quote. And might just go to the last, we're almost there, almost at the end. Another slide. So, how can you get involved? What can you do? Obviously, you guys are probably, I don't know, master's students. People might be, other people here, I think, not sure, they may have just got general interest in planning, or they're students as well. So we're encouraging people to engage in the planning system wherever they can. And so, for example, as I mentioned before, there's the local provision schedule process that lots of councils are going through, which really dictate the future of each council's area. And there's a guide down here on how to engage in that process. Encourage people to get involved next year with a review of the state planning provisions. Like PMAT's Facebook page, follow what the work that PMAT's doing. You can join our database. There's a place you can subscribe through our website. Donate to our campaign. Help build the alliance. So encourage any local groups that you know that might want to join the alliance. Meet with politicians, talk to family, talk to friends. About planning and how it will create our future. And and if there's anything you want to meet with PMAT about any case studies that might be interesting, we're always happy to meet with people and groups. And next slide. So this is the guide that we have at the moment that's relevant to a lot of councils. The copies here and on our website, which is sort of just providing a guide to how people can navigate the local provision schedule process, because it's actually quite complex, but it's a really important thing to get involved in. And Hobart City Council will probably advertise their local provision schedule maybe in February next year or towards the end of this year, something like that. So Hobart's about to go through this process. And I think it's last slide. And jump onto our website and find out more if you're wanting to see some of the work we're doing. And that's it. So I think the idea was to have some questions now, or discussion.
If someone has questions.
Anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I have two questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. The first one is, do you know any local companies that are very keen to help improve the system, and how do they do? And the second question is, many protected area or protected species are not protected quite well at the moment, mostly because the government don't have enough money to support them. So do you have any suggestion?
Sure, okay, so there's two questions. The first question was asking if there's any businesses that support the kind of work that we're trying to achieve, is that right?
Help improve the system.
To help improve the system?
Yeah.
Look, I don't know. That's the first question. I'll come back to the second question in a minute. There may be like planning consultancies that may share some of our concerns, for example, but I don't know if there's any businesses per se that are advocating for improvements in the system, because all our alliance members, for example, they're all community groups, And I was actually discussing this with someone today. You know, if we were approached by a business to join the alliance, would we say yes to that? And we probably at this stage wouldn't, but we would encourage businesses to advocate for good planning, because essentially, depending on what style of business, it's good for social licence to have a good planning system. It makes it easier for industry to have good planning, robust decision making. And then the second question was, there's a lot of threatened species at the moment that...
Protect areas.
Oh, protected areas
Yeah.
that aren't being... that.
Yeah, because they don't have money.
Okay, so the question is, there's a lot of protected areas in Tasmania, but they're not necessarily being funded well for good management?
Yeah, or is there any way they can create income by themselves?
Well, I guess it's a tricky question, but the question is, can they create income on their own? Well, I'd say they already do, because through park fees, people are accessing national parks and paying to do so. There is, at the moment, it's cheaper to go to those parks if you're a local, so they're trying to make it easier for locals to keep visiting and charging more to our visitors. There's a view that visitors need to be charged more, or interstate or international visitors to use our parks to help raise revenue. But also, it's a government's choice in how they spend their budgets, and it's just where priorities of government are. So there is definitely a view that there's been a focus on national parks and reserves focusing on tourism rather than on what they're mainly created for. Obviously they're created for recreation, but also for their natural and cultural values. So they're really been set aside for their natural and cultural values and recreational use, but it's important that they maintain those values at the same time. So they're not necessarily there to generate money within the park, but there'll be lots of, for example, businesses outside those areas that can benefit. Does that answer your question?
My question is, in the planning, Tasmanian Planning Scheme, the Aboriginal heritage is not reflected in the planning, and the Aboriginal people have lived here for 40,000 years. They lived here well before the European settlement, but the most of the architect in Tasmania is Eurocentric in expression, and it doesn't have any Aboriginal identity. Do you think the government should make the necessary planning strategy to reflect the Indigenous people in the architecture or the heritage of the planning scheme?
Well, essentially, I'm not Tasmanian Aboriginal, and we don't have any Tasmanian Aboriginal groups as part of the Alliance. We have met with members of the Aboriginal community or different areas, trying to seek what their view is, and obviously there's different parts of the Aboriginal community. One point of view I was given is that whatever, from their perspective, white people have, whatever the equivalent is, like for built heritage, for example, Aboriginal heritage should have the equivalent. So, it's not necessary. We're raising the question around why isn't there an Aboriginal code, and we're happy to advocate that there should be, but really it's not up to us. So I think really recently I've just found out someone who I can talk to within one of the Aboriginal community groups here that might give me some more insight into that, because it's not easy to navigate, essentially. But there is a view that because there's a built heritage code, that there should be an equivalent, which is the Aboriginal Heritage Code. Any other questions? Yeah.
When you say that PMAT is an advocacy group, how does it go about its advocacy for issues that may be raised
with you, say through the platform that you're advocating people join, or groups. We three are from a particular interest group,
Sure.
and we would be seeking advice on how we go about a particular issue which is unfolding on Druthi Point at the moment, with 3,500 houses being built in a very small area.
Yeah.
So the advice that we need will be, how do we combat this sort of thing going ahead? Because it's totally out, it's just ridiculous. What form does your advocacy take? Is it in being able to speak to government or try to adjust the code as it stands?
Well, essentially we work at all different levels. So we're definitely working with local community groups on particular issues. We wouldn't necessarily work on every issue because it depends, everything's done through our remit, because basically the almost 70 groups who've signed on to this, agreed to those principles, and so that gives us the authority to speak on their behalf through that lens, so we can't go beyond that. So that's why we don't have a position on any development, because we don't have authority to have a position, but with developments that are clearly inconsistent with the plannings, with our principles, then we may engage in that process, or not, and we wouldn't necessarily get down into the detail, but for example, we've commented a lot on the Huntingfield land supply order process because it fails so many elements of our platform that we've actually used that as an example to show that that's a flawed process. So for example, Huntingfield will deliver one of the most dense subdivisions in Tasmania, one of the biggest and most dense subdivisions in Tasmania's history, but it hasn't even gone out for public comment and won't.
Yeah. This will actually make Huntingfield look like a pimple.
Yeah, so we think Huntingfield will deliver around 1,000 houses, so that'll have massive implications. The government won't tell us exactly the number, but if you look at what the residential standards allow in that particular location, because they've actually written their own specific residential rules, it's really dense. So your question, so we work very much at the grassroots level, and then we also work in the media. So we're making media comment on radio or in the print media, online, and then we're also in the Parliament. So we brief the upper house when there's particular bills. We've been given that opportunity probably 3 or 4 times now, and we've been successful in getting amendments into some bills. Like we helped improve the process that will deliver the Tasmanian planning policies, even though we still welcomed them at the time, but we still prefer state policies over Tasmanian planning policies. So anyway, but then on other issues like the major projects bill, which we worked on hugely last year, we put up 25 amendments and got none. So, but anyway, we're working at the political level as well. Yeah.
So if I could make a comment, I'm one of the members, I'm part of a group that's a member of one of the 70, and I'm only a recent member. To me, the value of PMAT is they're independent, apolitical and professional. And it doesn't stop, it means that we have to do our own hard work on local issues, like you will have to do. But PMAT is a fantastic resource for giving you independent professional advice and linking with other groups who are having similar issues. So a remarkable resource, well respected in Parliament because they're independent and professional.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yeah, so we will work with any political colour basically to deliver our platform, and apolitical.
Can you say a little bit more about the Tasmanian planning policies? I think you said they're due to be finalised in October.
Yeah. So they're not. They've put out a scope. The government has put out a scoping document, which I haven't actually read yet, but I imagine they're scoping about what they should include in the Tasmanian planning policies, and the Tasmanian planning policies, I think, will inform to some degree the LPSs, local provision schedule, but not till a later date. And essentially, they're signed off by the minister, not by the parliament, unlike state policies. So we're just concerned around how effective, I guess, they'll be in, first of all, how they'll consult with the community. How community driven will it actually be? So I guess the other part of this problem is that we're facing in terms of the Tasmanian Planning Scheme is the former head of the Property Council chaired the planning reform that delivered the Tasmanian Planning Scheme. So the former head of the Property Council chaired the committee essentially that delivered the statewide scheme. And so there is a concern that it's very development focused and driven. But also we're also getting feedback too that developers and councils and planners are finding the new system really complex when in the past it wasn't this complex. So we're hearing that there are concerns within the property sector as well around just how complicated the system is now. So yeah, I guess that's a long way around of answering your question. Is given the flavour of the Tasmanian Planning Scheme and what it delivers for the development sector and making it easier to, for example, in the residential zones, a very good example. I don't know how well the Tasmanian planning policies will reflect community values. These kind of community values.
Is the government asking for submissions from the public?
Yes, I'm pretty sure it's open to everybody. So
one can just dial it up, Google Tasmanian planning policies, and one will find out what the government's up to there.
Yeah, you should be able to. I got the email today, and I can't remember if it's the Department of Justice or can't remember which department it's come from, because it may have come from the Planning Policy Unit, but it's definitely not being run out of the Planning Commission. So yeah, I can't remember which department it is. But yeah, type in scoping Tasmanian planning policies and it should come up. It's due end of October. And if you don't have any luck finding it, just email me and I can forward you the documents.
Okay.
Soph?
Yeah?
You answered that guy's question partly in the last response when you talked about the Property Council.
Yeah.
So your question was what businesses can influence planning schemes, I think. Property Council influence it in certain directions. And you've also got the Real Estate Institute.
Yeah.
They have open lines to politicians and government. So they have professional lobbyists that represent them in Parliament. So they're a business. They're run for business and all their members are developers. So there's an example of how business can influence a planning scheme.
Yeah.
But they have professional lobbyists who lobby the government for change.
Yeah.
And you don't see those lobbyists. You can find their names, they're on a register, but they walk around in Parliament and they knock on doors because they're on a register.
Well, the Parliament is corrupt, isn't it?
And further to that, there's a bill just being tabled in Parliament, or about to be tabled. So it'll be due to be debated at any time. That is, the Liberals have tabled a bill to look at political donation reform, and in other states in Australia they've banned donations, for example, from property developers, but they haven't done that in Tasmania. So there's actually an email do-gooder campaign that's just about to be circulated, calling on the government to basically tighten the political donation laws, because we want transparent decision making, and if you're getting paid by certain sectors of the community, there is concern that those decisions can be swayed in different directions that aren't necessarily the best outcome for the broader community. So that bill is really important. And then the other thing that Tasmania is lacking is also a proper integrity commission. So we've got the weakest in Australia, and so that's another way of keeping decision makers like politicians to account, and we don't have that in Tasmania. So there's a few compounding issues.
Sophie, one of the other businesses, but people don't usually consider them a business, is the local council. And for instance, the Central Highland Council has been advocating against what the planning authority has put out for agricultural land, and they want it classified as land under the old rural scheme. So in our meeting with a person in the council, they were very professional, very knowledgeable and influential, and some people would say that's the exception, but my experience with the council is it can be positive, and they are a business that can influence to a fair bit the planning scheme that applies.
Yeah. And I guess that's how it's implemented. The council can influence that, but there's also a view that when they developed the Tasmanian Planning Scheme, that a lot of councils felt overridden by the state government, and it was sort of hoisted on local government rather than something that local councils were calling for themselves. So there was essentially probably about 8 years of calling for a statewide scheme, especially from the property council, prior to the statewide scheme being developed. And so, certain sectors of the community were calling for that. And PMAT that formed because we're so concerned about it, but we made the conscious decision not to campaign against the statewide scheme because we thought that would be too difficult and that we'd try to improve it instead. But we were definitely concerned that the statewide scheme was a really blunt instrument, and that local character will suffer as a consequence of the scheme. So it makes it easier for property developers, but it's not necessarily the best outcome for the community. And I heard this great quote on the radio the other day from a woman being interviewed by Leanne Compton, and I can't remember her name unfortunately, but she said, if there's one thing COVID has taught us, which I felt was a really great thing to say, she said, it has taught us that we live in a community and not in an economy. And I think this is what part of what PMAT does is really trying to give a voice to the community and our values, and we should be at the table with the property council. We're not saying we're anti-development, we're saying we want to be treated equally with the development sector, so we get a balanced approach to planning, so we get good outcomes for everybody and not just property developers essentially.
Sophie, I have two questions. The first relates to the apparent absence of the opportunity to look for middle ground. You have the developers on one end who want to maximise profits and maximise their use of the land that's available at the expense of all other. But at the other end of the scale, you have people who want to protect it for every reason and not have any development at all.
Yeah.
But neither of these presentations today have talked about an opportunity for conciliation and consultation with each other.
Yeah, well, I guess we have to some degree, because this is where we're saying let's look at developing a values-based planning system for Tasmania. So in other words, let's identify what it is that we value about our community, what makes Tasmania special, and then allow development around that. So that would be a middle ground, and so maybe people aren't going to be making as much money as they would if they could just go in and build a 100% concrete roof.
Just to follow through on that, picking up on the point about the fact that councils are themselves a business, and I recognise Helen on Zoom and Bill here in present, but one council in particular has clearly stated that their objective is to maximise their rate revenue and pay for all of the new things that they now need to do that they never used to have to worry about doing.
Yeah.
Ergo, that means more development, more of it on small plots,
that's right.
and so on.
Yeah.
So
Where
do we fit in as community groups with councils who see it as their business to grow their business?
Yeah, and this is why being involved at the local provision schedule level can help. Obviously you can't do it in every area across your municipal area, but there's an example that we're working on the East Coast, and I know it's a particularly special area, but essentially what we've done through the local provision schedule process is identify the special values that should be maintained, and then development is still allowed within that. So this is why we're saying we need to identify all those special values about Tasmania, because otherwise we will become like everywhere else. And so I guess that's the choice we need to make as a community, because otherwise it will be it will be growth at every cost.
And if I can, just one more thing, but through your relationship with the university and or your own organisation, would there be, for argument's sake, a student who would want to get involved with a community group that's been newly formed to look at this huge development on Druthi Peninsula of another 3,000 houses, 6,000 people, and no infrastructure, and follow through with the group to see what doesn't happen under the planning scheme?
Quite potentially. I will be having a meeting with someone soonish who, I can raise that with them. But this is the whole problem, is it's the same at Kingborough with the Huntingfield development. I know it's a different scale, but it's still big, especially because there's a whole lot of other development going on there as well. And we're already seeing it with traffic congestion, soft and hard infrastructure. Schools aren't coping, medical facilities aren't coping, and we see it. And the other thing I do with another hat on is I convene the Face and Action Network, which has been advocating for natural cultural values on the East Coast for almost 30 years. And it's the same kind of issues we see there with the National Park, for example. This is pre-COVID, so it's changed since COVID, obviously. But we had 310,000 visitors a year, and the government's approach is to build more infrastructure and just plan for growth. But what we're saying at Fraser, and I think you can see it as a microcosm to some degree of Tasmania, is what we've said there is, okay, we need to look at managing for the visitor experience and having less people on the track, and rather than just building more infrastructure and allowing more growth, because it's alienating for the community, for the locals. They don't want to go there anymore. It's not a great experience for everyone on the walk. Some people don't mind that, but there's others that just are totally turned away by that many people. And so it's this big question around growth at all the cost of the values. And one of the things that a UTAS academic has said actually was in order to have a sustainable tourism industry, you need to have a tourism industry that's supported by locals, because that's what's going to help have a local support will help have a sustainable tourism industry. And it's the same kind of thing. So the values that the locals value are the values that people come to see at Freycinet. And so if you can keep the locals happy by maintaining the values that they care about, then you're going to maintain the values of everybody, essentially. But the government hasn't quite got that. And it's really a no-brainer. And it would actually make us leaders, I think, globally, if we were able to do that. And so I'd love Peter Gutman to sort of understand what we're talking about and saying, actually, there's huge advantage to Tasmania in actually looking after all these values that we have. Druthi Point is one of them. Being able to see that incredible grassy headland from a capital city is pretty incredible. Same with the mountain. But yeah, I can see the owners of Druthi Point, they probably want to capitalise on their assets. So, do you look at compensation, or, like they did at Dorney's house, for example, that was compensation. So yeah, it's a very, land use is complicated, fraught. Being a planner is not easy. I'm sure. I'm not a planner, but I talk with planners, and I know that, it's not an easy profession because it's hard to make everyone happy. And so I think it comes down to values, what we value as a community, but then having enough groundswell to somehow get our politicians and decision makers to listen, because you can't just build more and more infrastructure, because our way of life is going to be impacted. You can't just build infrastructure your way out of it.
It's especially difficult at the moment too, when you're talking to people about those development issues, but they're saying, they're homeless, or they can't get a rental property, or there's, such a shortage of housing.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to dismiss those concerns.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And I think part of the problem is that there's been such a failure of providing social and affordable housing for so long, and that the planning is just the ramification of it's the last kind of the last thing, a whole chain of events that leads to bad planning outcomes because, like for example, Huntingfield is going to be delivering social and affordable housing, but it's fraught basically. But the whole issue around housing is, it's much bigger than planning. So there's a whole, PMAT's actually about to write a position paper on social housing and affordability, and I guess we saw in the city where some of the big property developers tried to link building high-rise with homelessness, and it didn't work. And now we're seeing definitely the push at the moment to fast-track big areas of public land like Huntingfield to provide social and affordable housing, which is obviously really important, and we support housing for all, but there's also massive private houses being provided as part of that development, so that's why we get this massive density. So there's concerns around how that housing crisis is playing out in Tasmania and what it might do to opening up a whole lot of new areas to development.
Especially when they're going to be multi-level.
Yeah, well, at Huntingfield, they in the areas that we think will be for the social housing, they're 9.5 metres high, I think, or 9 metres, so they'll be 3 stories, and they're wall to wall terrace housing, but really dense.
Yeah, the same.
Yeah, there
Ah,
is
okay.
triplexes to this development with shared gardens.
Yep.
And,
Yeah.
and your point about feeling guilty because the comeback is, oh look, you're going to create homelessness by not supporting these housing developers. We get that all the time from the rubber stamp brigade, who want us to rubber stamp every single development regardless of quality, whether it's recommended for refusal or not. So, but you don't get drawn into that. You want quality housing,
Yeah.
right location for the right purposes,
Yeah.
for the right people.
Yeah.
And these $1 million development houses are not going to solve the housing crisis. It's irrelevant. The housing crisis will be solved when the state government starts to build more appropriate housing in the right locations, close to services, close to transport. Like when I did town planning in 1981, we were talking about then, and we still talk about it now. So it's just,
Yeah, and the government did actually develop a residential development strategy, which are 8 principles that residential development's supposed to meet. And we're actually saying with Huntingfield they're not meeting their own documents, basically. So, and interesting, there was some research put out in the last couple of months showing the level of mental challenges people were having during COVID living in high density. So, it's not necessarily great for mental health, physical health, well-being, neighbourly relations, that kind of thing. So, if you're interested, I can't remember who did the research, but it's, I can't even remember which article it was, but I've got a copy of it. Yeah, I think it may have been Sydney Morning Herald. But that's the most recent research on density. And, the view of that research was that those issues are only going to be compounded under climate disruption, with issues around fire and heat, where people have to stay indoors, and it's sort of like being in lockdown as well.
So can I just raise one more thing? I might have posted it on the planning website, and that's the livability census.
Oh, yeah.
So that's coming up soon, and it's well worth listening to or tuning into on Zoom. That was the biggest livability census done in Australia, and we've got the data for Hobart, and this will talk about what the people of Hobart actually want. These are the things we value, and it's things like good mobility, it's things like green spaces, it's things like all the things you probably agree with. So there's a link to that, I think, on your page now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess this is what we're talking about in terms of values-based planning system. Yeah. It's like, what is great for communities? What makes good, livable, connected communities, and our planning system isn't delivering that. And I guess this is where having a resilient, sustainable Tasmania is about livability, but also how we manage the natural environment and our cultural heritage.
Could I have one more question?
Sure, I have as many questions as you like.
Do Planning Matters have any plans to encourage government to develop a single entry point or a single portal into government? Successive governments have used the age-old strategy of obfuscation to stop people from getting information that is useful. For argument's sake, again, Ruthie Point, you want to know about, do they have a plan for the road network? You've got to get Ferguson to write.
Yeah.
Do they have a plan for schools in the area?
Yeah.
You've got to get someone else to write back.
Yeah.
And to get the whole picture, if it ever exists,
Yeah.
you've got to go through so many different channels, which of course then leads to the alternative, which is governments say, well, we didn't know all of that
Yeah.
because they're different arms, they're different bureaucracies,
Yeah.
have not talked to each other.
Mm.
So do you have a view on whether that would be a good mechanism to pursue?
Well, I guess we've been pursuing some of our questions through budget estimates. So that's a great way of asking members of Parliament directly, and also questions on notice and questions without notice, but I think just questions on notice, so you can ask some of your parliamentarians a list of questions. But yeah, look, I think this is a problem, and we're seeing it with Huntingfield too, with the road infrastructure, and there doesn't seem to be any strategic plan around transport, and this is one of the things that PMAT's been calling for. Is it's on the back of we've got a whole list of. We've been talking about a we need a state policy of transport and infrastructure, or transport and settlement. So we've said that we need state policies supported by community-endorsed state and/or regional policies on a wide range of issues, including, for example, affordable housing, biodiversity, fire management, climate change, coastal development, energy efficiency, equity, health, infrastructure, population, public transport, residential amenity, and transport, something that we have touched on as well. So there seems to be, this is part of the reason why we need a state policy and this strategic vision around what do we actually want Tasmania to be. And this is why we did welcome the Tasmanian planning policies with the scoping document that's out now, but we would prefer state policies to essentially deliver some kind of community will on what Tasmanians want going forward. Because, with my work on the East Coast, I do get contacted by property developers and who are looking for a social licence, and I would never give developers a social licence because it's not up to me, but they contact Face and Action Network essentially going, what do you think of this, or what do you think of that? And there was a particular developer from New South Wales who was saying to his other developer friends, come and have a low down in Tasmania, come and have a look what's going on. Because, there's just, I think part of the appeal of Tasmania is that we haven't been overdeveloped yet, and we're really at that crossroads point where we could ruin so many of the values of what makes us so special. But it's going to take community participation and people to be engaged, and the problem is the planning system, as you would all know, is so complicated that it's a really easy way to get changes happening behind the scenes, like, for example, developments in national parks, because people aren't engaging in the planning system. And it's especially difficult to try and explain to people how and why, how important it is. But that's what we need. We need the community to really engage, to say we want something different. And it comes down to, local government elections next year. That's one thing. State elections.
And also, I think we're getting to the point now where we need to be leading it rather than chasing it. You know,
Yeah, that's right.
Like you're
Yeah.
talking about with Coles Bay. We know what we want, we lead that, we promote that, and if you want to come here, that's what you've got to do, rather than us chasing, you know, what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's right. But I think the thing is with Coles Bay, for example, is that the power in Fraser Action Network, for example, is because so many people love Fraser and they all share those values and they're engaged. They're actually engaged in the future of the area, and that's what gives the community the power. Whereas so many people are disengaged in the future of their area, and they often don't get engaged until it's too late. So, and it's amazing how powerful the community is when it wants to be.
Like Hobart Not High Rise, for example. You know, they lead a lot of issues in Hobart. They have a big following, big membership.
Yeah.
And they can influence outcomes. Basically.
That's right. And that's right. And so, you know, some of those might only engage in planning, you know, 10 minutes out of a month or something, but they're still engaged. But it does take dedication from people who are leading it, like Brian Corr, who's the president of Hobart Not High Rise, and his team on the board. So, yeah, it does take time and dedication of people, but it's amazing what a few people can achieve. And it's really up to the community to engage in their future and to get the politicians to listen. I'd love Peter Gutman to listen to all our concerns.
Sophie, there's a question from Zoom, from
Yeah.
Helen Hutchinson.
Oh, yeah.
She asked, Sophie, I actually joined this webinar hoping to hear PMAT's comments on the Central Highlands Council's concerns. Will you comment on those?
Okay, so question from Helen Hutchinson around the local provision schedule for the Central Highlands. Okay, so the local provision schedule for the Central Highlands Council area is open until, can you remember?
Towards the end of October.
Towards the end of October. So to answer your question, Helen, I would be looking at our guide, which is here, which you can download from our website. It's on the front page, and it says something like how you can influence planning schemes. So if you go in there, you'll see our guide, and that just gives you a summary of the process of engaging in the local provision schedule process, and some of the questions you could ask your council. And it also has in the back of it a summary of all the zones and the codes under the statewide scheme. Those tables aren't all populated because we simply didn't have the resources to explain every code and zone, and obviously that's from our perspective. But essentially what I would do if I was looking at the local provision schedule for Central Highlands is I'd look at where all the specific area plans are, where are the site-specific qualifications, and where are the particular purpose zones, to see if there's if the council has varied any of the state planning provisions. I'm sure you probably don't understand all that. But essentially the council can either attribute every single title in the Central Highlands as one of the 23 zones, or it can choose from one of those three tools which I mentioned, and they're in that guide, which is the specific area plan, site-specific qualifications and particular purpose zones. So for example, in Glamorgan, where I've been involved in the local provision schedule process for a year and a half now, one of the first things I looked at was where the council was putting all the SAPs, and that was just in draft, so it's not a final decision. So this is, the council saying, okay, community, what do you think? And at Coles Bay, they wanted to put a SAP over Coles Bay and Swanwick, which is just before Coles Bay, and that SAP, so it's called a specific area plan, would have sat over the top of the low density residential zone and relaxed the standards. And what that would have allowed is non-residential uses across those entire sites. And that would have completely, over time, changed the character of Coles Bay and Swanwick. So, touch wood, we've argued to get rid of that. So they're the kinds of things you should be looking for in the Central Highlands local provision schedule. And also having a look at covenanted land, so how covenanted land has been dealt with under the Central Highlands local provision schedule. I think there might be 100 covenanted properties.
Something like that.
Up there, and I think the council has treated those largely as rural or agriculture, not necessarily for conservation, which is so that's something to look at. And that guide that that I was just talking about, in the back of that, there's about 3 sections on covenanted properties, because some councils are going, yep, we're going to put landscape conservation zone on those properties with a covenant, whereas other councils aren't treating them like that at all. So that's something to have a close look at.
Sophie, you might add that there's 3 sessions the council are putting on tonight, tomorrow and Thursday,
Okay.
which are drop-in sessions for people to find out.
Sure. So PMAT last week sent around, it's one of the things we do also send around updates, and we sent around an information on the local provision schedule process for Central Highlands, including the dates of the drop-in sessions, which I've just been reminded, thank you, that are on tonight, tomorrow night and the next night.
Yep.
And all those details are also on the Central Highlands website. Any other questions? Okay. What time is it? Anyone?
3:20.
3:20. Okay. Well, there's no more questions. If there's no more questions, we can probably wrap it up. But I'll be here if anyone wants to come and ask me some questions afterwards. Yeah. Anyway, well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for all your questions, and yeah, I hope that you've all learnt something.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
I should join you immediately.
Does the committee want a photo, Sophie?
Yeah, sure.
Send you a text.
Oh.
Thanks for watching the Zoom. Does he do any work?